Okay.
People listen to atheist in their title or godless in their title, those kind of things.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Or
Damn you,
skeptic
godless cranium.
trademark.
Damn you all to hell, godless cranium.
sure, but
Yo,
I mean,
No,
just,
Godless Cranium rocks.
I love godless cranium.
and he's
I
an
mean, I do
atheist.
not like godless cranium. I mean, he's nice. He's
Oh, that guy's the worst. Don't encourage him.
yeah, dick godless cranium.
Don't encourage him.
Tell me, would a nice guy do this?
Actually, there are 200 species of squirrels in the world, according to National Pornographic. Just Googled it a couple hours ago.
Before we get started, I just wanted to say a couple of things. This video is a response to a recent Rachel Oates video titled Let's Talk Anti-Theism, where Rachel lays out some of her thoughts regarding anti-theism and why she doesn't identify as an anti-theist. First, I have nothing personally against Rachel. I love her channel, I'm a big fan of her work, and I think she's an important voice here on YouTube. It's also not an attempt to create drama or to embarrass Rachel in any way. This is merely my opinion on what she said in this one specific video, which can be applied to other people I've heard make similar arguments. Second, this isn't an attempt to get her to identify as an anti-theist, although if that turned out to be the case, I wouldn't be upset. This video is more about clarifying my own position and hopefully clearing up some of the misconceptions I believe Rachel has, and many other people have, about anti-theism in general. Third, her video is around 20 minutes long, and for the sake of brevity, I've cut out big chunks of it. However, I've tried to keep the context intact when it comes to the clips I did use. As always, the link to the original video will be in the description box, and I hope you'll give it a watch for yourself. Let's get started. Release the Godless Inquisition.
But for me personally, I don't think I'm at a point where I'm willing to give myself a label that essentially argues that every case of believing in a god is always a bad thing. I just said I wasn't prepared to give myself that label yet.
I don't think most anti-theists jump out of the gate and identify as anti-theists. I'm sure some did, but I would bet they're the exception and not the rule. I'll use myself as an example. I started out as a Christian because I was raised as a Christian and believed the authority figures in my life who told me their specific deity was correct. When I got older, I started to have serious doubts. Things I had taken for granted didn't match with what I observed in the real world. However, I still identified as a Christian. My search continued, and I finally realized I no longer believed in the Christian faith. Instead of identifying as an atheist, I instead began exploring other faiths in an attempt to hold on to some sort of spiritual existence or spiritual worldview. When that failed, I identified as an agnostic for a while, and gradually I came to grips with the label of atheist. I found that when I identified as an agnostic, most religious people took that to mean that their worldview was just as valid as mine, and therefore they were justified in their beliefs. I didn't feel that way, and by adopting the atheist label, I was able to adequately express my disbelief in any deity, and tell any believer who asked that I did not believe their deity existed, and that I likely had solid reasons for my disbelief. It wasn't until later that I adopted the anti-theist label. Now, earlier in this video, Rachel basically says that the label doesn't much matter. It's the actions that do. And I would agree with that in principle. Even in my own journey, I had been acting like an anti-theist long before I identified as an anti-theist. I'd been writing against religion and arguing against the existence of any supernatural deity. I just hadn't formally said that I was an anti-theist. But I do think believing in God, or any untrue thing, is a bad thing. It might not always lead to negative results in the moment, but the positive results could be achieved without believing in things that are demonstrably not true. But we'll get into that a bit later.
I think one of the things I'm worried about is that people aren't going to like this because sometimes they look at me and they think I'm this, like, atheist spokesperson on YouTube, and they think I'm this, like, face of atheism, or they think I'm someone who matters, and so a lot of people say that, you know, what I choose to label myself, like whether I choose to take on that anti-theist label or not, that matters to some people because they think it's like I'm sending a message.
You do matter, Rachel. I think everyone matters. Everyone influences the behaviors of the people around them to some degree. For example, atheists who apologize for and promote Christianity normalize Christianity in society. They provide cover for believing things that aren't true. You, Rachel, have over 20,000 people who will potentially listen to your videos. You have a bigger footprint as far as influence than someone who only really talks to their family and friends about their lack of belief or disbelief in a god. What you say could potentially reach 20, 30, 90,000 people in a very short amount of time, so you very much are sending a message. That doesn't mean you need to adopt the anti-theism label, but when you say things like...
So if we go into this kind of whole topic and take the definition of anti-theism to be the belief that theism and religion are harmful to society and people, and that even if theistic beliefs were true, they would be undesirable. That's the definition that we're going to take.
You inadvertently make people like me, who do openly identify as anti-theists, look unreasonable. If theism were true, you could easily make the case that if I believed it were true and continued to tell people it wasn't, that I was acting unethically, especially if my actions resulted in people being condemned to unending torture. I'm not sure where you got that definition, but I oppose God belief because I don't think it's true. If I thought it was true, I wouldn't make videos opposing belief in a deity. I would cease to be an anti-theist.
But ultimately, I think instead of taking on a label or not, I think what matters is that I'm willing to openly acknowledge and condemn the times when religion is harmful, but similarly, I'm willing to remain impartial at times, and I don't just want to go into everything with this, well, it's religion, so it's going to be terrible attitude. I think it's important that every time I talk about religion on my channel and make a judgment about things in a video, I want to go into it with kind of as little bias as possible. And I want to go into it being able to kind of like judge each specific case. And I want to be able to acknowledge when a group of people who may be religious do something good. And I want to acknowledge when a group of people who may be religious do something harmful.
I work in social services, and before I began working with the deaf-blind, I worked with teens for a time. I often had to coordinate and work with religious charities and organizations, and I wouldn't deny that they can do great work. I wish they did it for different reasons, but I wouldn't argue that what they're doing as far as feeding people, like in your example, is necessarily a bad thing. People are being fed, and that's a good thing. However, in the larger scheme of things, once that very narrow experience is over, I would still like to live in a society grounded in reality, which encourages people to help others for better reasons than God demands it. There are very good reasons to be altruistic, and some of them are even selfish in nature. For example, I'm one illness away from being the unluckiest person in my immediate vicinity. By assisting those who are currently some of the unluckiest people, I'm helping to assure that if I become unlucky at some point, that I live in a society that helps support me in my time of need. That's the sort of society I want to help foster. I don't want myself or others to live in a society where one illness can ruin their lives financially. Of course, that doesn't mean we can totally mitigate the damage to someone's life who has been diagnosed with some sort of life-altering illness. But it does mean that we can mitigate that damage and hopefully help them through that crisis, which in turn could translate into that help being given to me if I'm ever in need of such help. If you could wave a magical wand and everyone in the world stopped believing in God, do you think all food banks and charitable organizations would cease to exist? I don't think so. I think they'd carry on doing their work, but they'd be able to do so without the baggage that religion brings with it. People shouldn't have to listen to sermons based on nonsense to receive a hot meal.
So in that case, yes, I do believe that a lot of religions are, on the whole, harmful to people and harmful to society, and I do think that on the whole, we'd be better off without them.
My point exactly.
But I'm also not going to sit here and try and argue that every single religion in the world is this terrible, horrible, disgusting thing that we should eradicate with, put all of our effort into eradicating it. I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to try and argue that every single consequence of religion or belief is terrible, because I just don't think that's fair. And that's the reason I'm not comfortable labeling myself an anti-theist.
Well, I definitely don't put all of my energy into eradicating religion, but I do put some effort into arguing against the untrue parts of those religions. I also argue against the dogmatic nature of those religions. I'm also under no illusion that religion will be wiped out completely. I think there will always be irrational actors or people who are swayed by religious arguments. However, I do want to erode its power as much as possible and promote reality-based thinking as opposed to supernatural thinking. And so I dedicate a portion of my time and resources to promoting my desired outcome and arguing for why I think it's reasonable to want such an outcome.
One example I'd give is Buddhism, right? I might not really think there's much to Buddhism. I think it's full of wishy-washy stuff, all the spirituality and enlightenment and I don't know, I don't think there's much hard evidence for a lot of it. I don't think it's, I don't know, I just find it all a bit wishy-washy and bleh. But that said, it's not this horrific, harmful thing on the whole, because it gave us some great things like meditation, which is actually a really great tool for relaxation and calming us down, and just helping heighten self-awareness and our, giving us a chance to understand ourselves and our bodies and our thoughts and stuff like that,
Right, but you don't have to believe in nonsense to practice meditation. You can also be an atheist and be a Buddhist. You're right that some Buddhists believe in supernatural woo, like reincarnation. And like other religions, I think those parts should be fought against. You don't have to believe in supernatural nonsense to meditate or to adopt a basic metaphysical worldview that Buddhism tends to promote, such as conserving the environment or treating others with kindness. Bottom line is, you can accomplish the reality-based good parts found in Buddhism without believing in the nonsense parts. You can say the same about any religion that relies on the supernatural as a building block.
I mean, on the whole, I think people who believe in Buddhism and stuff and follow Buddhism and their practices and whatever, I think on the whole it can lead to people being really happy. It can do some great things. It's not that I'd actively encourage people to seek out Buddhism at all. It's just I'm not against it either. I'm kind of indifferent to things like that. And it's because I can look at religions like Buddhism and see that they can do great things for people that I don't want to sit here and say every religion in the world is terrible and should be eradicated.
Alright, so let's look at Myanmar, which is being rated the most generous country in the world. Myanmar is close to 90% Buddhist, and their Buddhist beliefs are partially responsible for their generosity. For example, quote, "The foundations attributed Myanmar's giving to the deeply rooted charitable traditions of Theravada Buddhism, the country's dominant religion. There are 500,000 Buddhist monks in Myanmar, making up about 1% of the country's population of about 50 million, a higher percentage than any other country. Giving monks money and food is a way for followers to earn merit. It enables monks who cannot work to spend their days meditating and reciting Buddhist prayers." End quote. But there are also negative consequences of their beliefs, rooted in their dogmatic belief in reincarnation and suffering. Quote, "Abortion is considered murder, and all violent acts cause horrific karmic consequences. Homosexuality in itself is not specifically condemned by scripture, but opinions vary, especially among various Buddhist cultures. Buddhists in the United States are generally very accepting, while some Asian Buddhists are generally strongly opposed to homosexuality. It is believed that divorce wouldn't occur if one follows Buddhist precepts, but a couple is not condemned if they separate due to vast personal differences. In Theravada countries, gender roles are generally traditional, example, women as child caretakers and men as providers, but less rigid as contemporary demands are made on women, example, working women." End quote. Some of those beliefs are a direct consequence of believing in karmic woo, instead of basing their beliefs on reality. Obviously, religions such as Christianity rely far more on the supernatural than Buddhism, but when your basic assumptions are wrong, you will see consequences down the road. Here's another consequence of their supernatural beliefs in karma. It also affects how they think about euthanasia. Their belief in karma has a very real effect on how they think ethically about end-of-life decisions. Again, you can take the good parts of Buddhism and leave behind the supernatural nonsense. If you want to promote generosity, there are ways of doing that. For example, you can foster a society that rewards generosity. But that's a whole other subject we can get into later. This is already turning out to be a lengthy video.
You know? And then there are religions like Christianity, right? And I talk about that a lot on my channel, especially Christianity, just because I've been exposed to it more, because I've read a bit more about it. That's the only reason I cover it more than others. And while I don't think there's any truth in, this idea of one God creating the world, and I don't think there's any truth in it, and I do think a lot of their teachings can be very harmful. I think it's important to acknowledge that I can see how it does help some individuals sometimes in society. Does that make sense? So even as something as small as creating a community where a person feels happy and comfortable and safe.
You live in the UK, right, Rachel? As far as I know, the UK is by and large full of atheists or people who don't actively believe in God. Would you say that you feel safe in your community? Are there places you can go where you can feel part of a community outside of the church? And the further away from religion, or the more secular your society becomes, would you think those communities and institutions that strengthen community will become stronger or weaker?
I can't be against that, That doesn't mean I'd encourage people to go to a church when they're lonely. That doesn't mean that I don't recognize people can get that feeling in other places. And that doesn't mean I'm ignoring the fact that, in order to get that comfort and happiness and friendship and, the nice little group, that a person is believing in something for which there's no evidence. I acknowledge all of that. And I acknowledge that some people see that those things as big problems and stuff. But the thing that I think I'm trying to say is that even things that have a majority of bad points, sometimes you have to acknowledge that a little bit of good can come out of it.
It sounds to me like you already recognize that churches and belief in the supernatural aren't needed and lead to some horrible consequences. You also seem to acknowledge that you can find the, quote, good parts of the religion elsewhere. So I'm not sure why we should promote or pardon organizations and belief systems that are based on things that aren't true. Ironically enough, the Bible has helped shape my view on this. In Matthew, Jesus argues that building your hypothetical house on the sand of lies will lead to its collapse. I agree with him, which is why I don't think we should be building our societies around untrue beliefs and dogmatic supernatural woo. I would argue we should build societies on what we currently understand to be true.
It's like, a comparison I sometimes use is like shoplifting, right? I've worked quite a lot in retail in the past. Like, I started when I was 14, and I've worked jobs on and off for a long time in retail, like mostly part-time when I need a bit of extra cash. But the point is, I know the damage shoplifting can do, right? I don't think it's something we should ever encourage. I think we should teach kids from a young age that shoplifting is wrong and tell them why it's wrong and explain to them the consequences and the damage done by shoplifting. And I think on the whole, shoplifting is a bad thing for society. However, if shoplifting a little bit of food is the only way a child, like a specific child, can get a meal one day, then I am prepared to overlook the shoplifting just this once and recognise that, yeah, something good did come out of that. And that kid might be able to get food elsewhere, you know, through social services, homeless shelters, food banks, and so on. I get that. You know, shoplifting might not be the only way for them to get food, but there might be reasons that they don't want to go down those other routes, and that shoplifting seems like the only possible option for them, right? And so, in this very, very specific scenario, I can understand that shoplifting can actually do some good for a person.
That's a bad analogy, Rachel. Nothing about hunger is based on the supernatural. It's all based on reality. Hunger pains are very, very real. I was going to construct a more accurate analogy, one based on alchemists who believed that they could change wood into gold, but decided against it. Instead, I'd like to ask you, Rachel, do you think it would be ideal if that hungry child didn't have to go to a woo peddler at all for their food? Imagine if their options aligned with reality, and they no longer had to visit a place that might teach that they deserve hell, or that their sexual orientation is an abomination before the eyes of their God. Imagine a world where the trillions of dollars funneled through faith economies was made available to those community-based programs. Instead of enriching wealthy church organizations spreading woo, that money was funneled into the sciences and into community services that help people like the hungry child you referenced. Imagine instead a world where their options consisted of community centers, food banks, or even humanism centers that promoted healthy, reality-based spiritual methods, such as the meditation you mentioned earlier, or places of learning where they explore methods of self-examination or philosophical viewpoints to help people think about their place in the universe. All of them based on reality instead of primitive myths that aren't based on reality. Would you consider such a place more ethical, more rooted in reality, better overall for the starving child? I want to promote such a society. I don't want to force religious people to give up their faith. I don't want to jail or harm them physically. But I think it's a worthy endeavor to weaken their stranglehold on society so we can eventually reach a point where they naturally fall along the wayside and are finally relegated to the dustbin of history.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I can't bring myself to condemn every single religion in the world. I can't bring myself to condemn every person in the world who believes in a religion and imply that it's all completely harmful by giving myself this anti-theist label.
I'm an anti-theist and I don't condemn every religious person. I argue against their bad ideas. I'm very much aware that there are very good, very ethical, and very intelligent theists out there. I just happen to disagree with them, but that doesn't mean I condemn them as human beings. However, it's okay to disagree with people and stand against their ideas when you don't think they're true. This is why I'm an anti-theist.
And who knows, in a year, 5 years, 10 years from now, I might be embracing that anti-theist label and saying, yeah, I'm an anti-theist.
Perhaps, and I hope I play a small part in that transition if it does take place. But even if it doesn't, I'll continue to enjoy your content and take pleasure in watching your channel grow. Thanks for all that you do, Rachel, and if you watch this video, I'm open to talking about this on a stream, maybe on the Non Sequitur show sometime. I think we could have an interesting conversation. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching, take care, and cheers.